Well, welcome to the first of our third series, I think, of Women in Landscape Architecture. And we're thrilled to bits to have Phil back talk about Elisabeth Beazley, who I'm sure has been on all our shelves and so little known, I think. So, and Phil has a very interesting career. He had an advanced diploma in historic landscape at Cambridge, and then went on to do a PhD at Sheffield University, where he comes highly recommended by Jan Woudstra. And he was researching there the origins of Scotland's country parks. And that's where he encountered Elisabeth Beazley's work. And he has recently completed an 18-month contract with Imperial College London, exploring local authority approaches to green infrastructure in the UK and Northwest Europe. So he's a very broad thinking and very relevant man. So Phil, please crack on and good luck.
Okay, thank you very much, Annabelle. I hope you can all see my screen. And a somewhat mysterious title as we progress. Certainly, I think that Elisabeth Beazley, as Annabelle said, is a lesser known practitioner of landscape architecture. It's possible some of you have never heard of her, but she's certainly much less well known than many of her contemporaries like Colvin or Tyrwhitt. When she died in 2018, I found no published obituary. There's no Wikipedia page for her. There was no announcement of her death in the professional press, and that would all suggest less significance. But in fact, she was a major contributor of ideas around the settings of buildings and the design of landscapes for visitors, as well as in other more specialist areas. I think she deserves to be better known, and I hope that this talk might help towards that end. I first came across her 3 or 4 years ago when researching my thesis at the National Trust for Scotland. And this is the only photograph I've come across so far. I think it was probably taken in 1973 when she was around 50 years of age. I do know where it was taken because I recognize it. It's the visitor centre at Cullin Castle in Ayrshire, and that's a location that we'll be returning to later. So what are my sources? Well, on the plus side, I've had help from her family. Her nephew James passed on a collection of reports that Elisabeth wrote to the National Trust for Scotland, and they made them available for me. In fact, I arrived about 3 days after the bundle of reports had arrived, so it was quite serendipitous that I got access to this material quickly. She, over a 20-year period from around 1962, she wrote 5 books as a sole author and at least 4 others as a joint author. And she wrote well over 50 articles and papers, mostly in the 1960s and 70s, for a variety of publications, including the Architect's Journal, the Architectural Review, and Country Life. And I found these books and articles to be good sources to uncover her enthusiasms and her principles. There are lots of reports on her many visits to countryside properties. The ones I've read were mostly for the National Trust for Scotland, and the observations and recommendations she makes in these illustrate her approach and her practice, I think, very well. And I'll be drawing in detail on those in a little while. But it would be less than honest of me not to admit 2 large gaps in our knowledge as it stands about her. We know very little about her professional practice beyond the fact that she worked for both the National Trust, and as far as records of that practice have not survived her. And although I know something about her work at the National Trust in England and Wales, lockdown has meant that I've been unable to close that gap. There is some material from her nephew at Swindon, and I wasn't researching the English National Trust at that time. So there's a gap in my knowledge that I intend to fill when the opportunity returns to us. Here's some personal background on her. She was born at Eastham on the Wirral near Birkenhead in June 1923, the second of 2 children. The Beazleys were a prominent local family, and her father was a decorated war hero who is more memorialized in two local parish churches. He died relatively young when Elizabeth was 14 and left a substantial financial legacy worth in today's money about £1.75 million. She was educated at St James's School in Malvern. That's a girls' boarding school that was run at that time by Alice Baird, herself an active proponent of garden design and of outdoor life. And she studied at the Architectural Association from 1940 to 1948, a long period of study that included a lengthy war interruption. Geoffrey Jellicoe was the director at that time, and Tyrwhitt and Colvin were both teaching there. Although strangely, I found no reference to this period at all in her writings. She married in 1977, in her mid-50s, to a naval captain from Tunbridge Wells. So she worked almost her entire professional life as a single woman. And she retired from her work at the National Trust in 1991, although in fact her output had slowed down a lot well before that. Her last work for the National Trust for Scotland, for instance, was in 1984. She began her professional life with the Lionel Brett practice in the 1950s, including work on the ill-fated Hatfield New Town project, where the practice designed houses that were ultimately damaged by storms. And she established her own private practice in the late 1950s, but she maintained contact with Brett and they collaborated on a book together, The Shell Guide to North Wales, in 1971. We know nothing of her practice, as I've said, but we know she maintained an expensive address in London and a second home in Wales, and we know she was a prominent contributor to leading journals, and she was appointed to a significant role in the National Trust. So it's safe to assume that her practice generated a good income and established a sustained professional standing and reputation. Now, here are three quotations as to how she saw herself. We're on this presentation today because we see her now as a landscape architect, but she in fact never saw herself in that light. She was a professional member of the RIBA and the Faculty of Surveyors, but she never joined the ILA. She said that she was an architect with an interest in landscape. And she explained this view in 1965 by suggesting that landscape architects were not seen in the same professional light as architects themselves, suggesting that she perhaps thought being called a landscape architect might undermine her professional standing. In 1969, she described a visit to a property as a joy to any architectural soul. And in 1970, she expressed an architect's disappointment with a book that she was reading. So we can see that she maintained this position of an architect with an interest in landscape throughout her career. And even in 1977, on her marriage certificate, she's described as an architect. Well, we're going to start by making a short detour. She had a holiday home in West Wales, as I've said, but her interest in Wales went much deeper than this. In 1959, she wrote a tour piece for the Architect's Journal. I have no reason why this tour should have been in that journal, but she wrote one setting out the sites that a motorist ought to go and visit on a tour of Wales, and also the problems they might encounter in their visits, with attention to detail such as good and bad signage of the destinations that they were attempting to reach. In 1967, she wrote a biography of Maddox. That followed a visit to Tremaddock with Clough Williams-Ellis, and it also generated, alongside the book, 2 papers as well. In 1971, she published this North Wales Guide, co-written with Brett, and that put her in the same canon of authors as John Betjeman, Michael Pitt Rivers, James Lees Milne, and W.G. Hoskins, all of whom contributed to this series. And again, she described herself in the author blurb as an architect. And she followed that up with North Wales Companion Guides in 1975 and a South Wales Companion Guide in 1977 and several papers. And we can also take a slightly longer detour because she traveled quite widely. We know from her writing that she visited Netherlands, Israel, and elsewhere. She always had a particular interest in Iran. And her writings suggest that what she called sporadic field work took place across many years between 1961 and the late 1970s. And she took a particular interest in the vernacular buildings in the area around Isfahan and the Iranian plateau. She was sufficiently recognized as an authority on Persian architecture by 1965 to be funded to complete a study begun by a Professor Stern, who had died suddenly. That study was eventually published in 1971. And she made expeditions to Iran that we know about in 1968, 1975, and a further visit in 1977. Altogether, I'm aware of 7 papers that she wrote on Iran and a co-authored book. So this talk is about Elisabeth's principles and her practice. And so I'm going to start with her principles, which aren't very difficult to find, but which can be very assured and very assertive. One of her earlier pieces, the second of her many papers that we know about, came in 1958, and it's a lengthy piece in the Architect's Journal on architectural character, in which she cites several examples to illustrate her view of what constitutes architectural character. One of the ones that she homes in on particularly is of Warkworth in Northumberland, which is what's pictured here. And here she's looking at a streetscape, primarily composed of historic terraced housing of what's now a conservation area, and the setting of that streetscape with the castle at one end of the high street, the church at the other end, and a bridge, a historic bridge for good balance. And for Beazley, character comes from this type of combination and contrast. But the character isn't just about the bigger picture. It also comes from examining the relationship between things like the wall area and the windows, the way the roof adjoins the wall, the extent to which the eaves project out from the walls. And she suggests that eaves need to project at least 12 inches. So it's also the detail down to quite a fine degree. And it's also the contribution to character, or against it, made by incidental features such as bus stops, street lamps, hoardings and signs. Now, this is very early work, but it's very characteristic of what came later. And we see this pattern repeated time and again, both in her writing and in her practice. For Beazley, it's not only about the larger scale or the view, it's also about the incidentals, the detail, down to what we might consider minutiae. And what's also interesting at this point, given her later reputation as a countryside specialist, is that her commentary doesn't reference green space at all, other than to deprecate what she considers its excessive use in new towns, where one thirsts for some contrast. And nor should we think that character derives solely from historic landscapes. She also drew attention to the importance of other structures, including industrial structures such as these, the power station chimneys at Stella on Tyneside, visible from miles away and giving a very small and otherwise unknown community an identity. And I'm particularly fond of this picture because my grandmother was born in Stella underneath the chimneys on the left-hand side of this picture. And she was also not afraid to criticize where character she felt was diminished or lacking. So I need to apologize at this point to anyone in the audience who comes from Watford, because this is what she had to say about Watford, a place of whose real character I know nothing, but which always makes me want to emigrate. And I suspect that most of us have places like that in the back of our minds that really present no redeeming features to us. 2 years after that paper, we come to the first of her books, Design and Detail of the Space Between Buildings. And here she reasserts that good design is not just about the buildings, but also about their settings, which are too often treated as a kind of no man's land where economy is the keynote, space that's of insufficient importance to be too troubled about. In the book, to how attention to this space can enhance both visually and practically. She notes that grass is the surface most commonly used, but as we've seen, she deprecated its excessive use. Its advantage, of course, is that it's cheap, but it's also unsuitable for heavy use. And she says very strongly, surface materials should be chosen to fit their purpose, again, both visually and practically, and with awareness of minor but important considerations, such as the footwear that women are likely to be wearing when walking across it, including stilettos. And in keeping with what we've seen already, she doesn't just focus on the main message, she goes into detail at quite a granular level as to how this can be achieved. So the book includes a great deal of technical detail, fully illustrated with sketch drawings on surfacing, fences, drainage, and so on, and practical guidance on how to implement these ideas and where to source the materials. So for instance, in discussing brick walls, she talks about their purpose and use, but then goes on to set out different design ideas, the materials that might be used, the need for expansion joints, the types of cement to be selected from, the options for coping and overhang. You get the idea. The book was very well received. One reviewer described it as one of the most useful books on landscaping of its period, and it was actually reworked and republished with Elisabeth's endorsement in 1990, with updates that reflected advances in both materials and the sources that she originally cited. She introduced some key principles in this book that we can see in all her later work. One of these was that rural roads and paths should have natural edges, not curbs, and especially not concrete. Footpaths, she said, should be a direct route because that's the route that people will always choose. But surfacing enables contrast and communicates in a subtle way to people where they can and should go and where they might not go. She addresses the idea of the tyranny of the motor car, the demand it places on space, the potential dangers, and the loss of aesthetic. And she notes that cars are incompatible with pedestrians, and so they need to be separated. And she's very opposed to what she called serried ranks of cars in car parks. She urges landscaping and the use of shrubbery and trees to mitigate the landscape of the car park. This is her second book from 1962, Designed to Live In. It has more of a focus on housing and on the practice of architecture, which should recognize more than just the client brief and should challenge in areas such as site, climate, suitability, and the materials to be used. But she also restates some of the ideas we saw in her earlier book. And she sets out here what she thinks is the challenge facing the architect, to imagine things as they might be, and not to see them only as they already are. Her third book was published 7 years later, and it takes us into the area where she was to focus for the remainder of her career, the countryside. It followed an article in Country Life discussing the perfect picnic place, which was written in 1965, and which responded to interest and concern about the growing enthusiasm for visiting and spending time in cars in the countryside. There was a good deal of attention being paid to the countryside in this period, including 3 Countryside in 1970 conferences led by the Duke of Edinburgh, which culminated in the Countryside Acts of 1967 and 1968, the setting up of the Countryside Commissions in England and Wales and in Scotland, and the creation of country parks as a way of providing space for countryside recreation without compromising the working or more scenic countryside. Now, I can say a lot more about that type of provision because that's the subject of my thesis. But let me say here that Beazley liked the idea, and it fits with her own ideas of adapting and managing space intelligently to accommodate visitors and visitor behaviours. This book was commissioned by RIBA, which is interesting in itself since her work thus far had not focused especially strongly on the countryside. But it allowed Beazley to extend her existing principles into a countryside setting. Country parks were expected to be new provision, but there was never enough money for that. So the slack was taken up by adapting existing facilities for greater numbers, and many venues struggled to address the new problems this created. This book, and much of Beazley's work from here onwards, was intended to support that transition from perhaps a historic site into a visitor destination. She encouraged landscape and pathway design and signage to promote visitor flow, to distribute visitors around the site, and the subtle use of furniture to indicate permission. For instance, placing picnic tables to indicate that you were allowed to have a picnic in that location. She spent a long time discussing car parks, the most important and the most difficult issue as she saw it. She suggested that car parks should be away from the main attraction, but linked with direct footpaths. They should, of course, be landscaped, and there should be a separate exit from the original entrance. She was very opposed to parking next to the building, and she singled out Tintern Abbey as particularly egregious in this respect. She also saw a need for separate visitor centres away from the main attraction, replete with information, and provided a long list of essential content for these centres, toilets, exhibitions, audiovisual, and so on, drawing on her experience of seeing this kind of provision in the USA. And as we saw in Wales, one of her favourite bugbears was signage. She wanted to see signage that was clear, well located, well designed, with correct typefaces and colours. She wanted signs to make people feel welcome and to give them permission to explore. This is something she felt was very important. She covers this ground repeatedly and is often very critical of the signage that she sees. This was intended as a practical handbook, down-to-earth information for those who have to get on with the job. And it brings that, once again, familiar mix of guiding principles, practical suggestions, design options, and attention to detail. So the idea of distributing visitors leads her to discuss trails to encourage exploration, and then how these trails should be surfaced, how they should be signposted, suggestions about seating and the bins, and even the provision of elbow rests for those wishing to use binoculars. She goes into depth on practicalities, suggesting materials, methods, and sources for virtually everything you can think of in a countryside site, from litter bin liners to the siting of a boat marina. And we also see another recurring Beazley characteristic, her reminding her readers, in this case site managers, of the blindingly obvious, such as the need for safety barriers at cliff edges. She is nothing if not thorough. She has a view on virtually everything. And there is a thankfully short discussion, for instance, in this book on the right nomenclature for the toilets. And this is her final book, in 1971, The Countryside on View, published just 2 years after Design for Recreation, but at a time when countryside recreation was still a continuing challenge and still not being responded to particularly effectively. This book looks particularly closely at visitor centres, their role in supporting the main attraction, and the facilities and services they should provide. She reimagines the visitor centre in this book as a honeypot, attracting visitors to browse the retail offer, enjoy tea and cake, and find out more through visiting exhibitions and displays. Her visitor centre is a service centre at a high standard, but able to withstand muddy feet. It should be an attraction, but it should not be the main attraction. And it should encourage visitors to go beyond the main attraction and explore the site more fully, both for their own enlightenment and to distribute visitors more widely and prolong their visit. And she recognized a variety of visitor expectations needing to be met. Some come to learn, some to study nature or architecture, some to find a picnic place or a place for children to play, some looking for quiet, some wanting to see nature. Sites needed to be more aware of these different motivations and to cater as diversely as possible for them. This was very sensible and would nowadays be standard thinking. But this was perhaps the first time many site managers would have come across this thinking in a countryside context. And she also urged imaginative reuse of redundant buildings, not least because they are part of the landscape that the visitor has come to see. And once more, the detailed drawings and guidance, where to site the car park, its surfacing, its landscaping, how big the spaces should be, how to mark them out, what signage to use, and where to buy the paint. And again, attention to the obvious, don't cite audio-visual equipment within reach of the visitor, and also the ludicrous. Visitor centre shops should, she thought, sell aerosol squashed fly remover for visitors' windscreens. So if we sum up her principles in these books, we see her setting out the principle, describing how it can be put into practice, offering ideas about location, design, separation, and so on, advising on materials and how to do it, setting out where to find those materials, and going into detail on things like signage, litter bins, and other incidentals. So these are the sort of things that we ought to be able to see in her work on the ground. And that takes me on to her practice. In 1965, Elisabeth became a member of the National Trust Executive Committee, and she served on that till 1991. She was also a member of its architectural panel, and she may have been involved in appraising new acquisitions. She was one of a group of 3 Graces, as they were known, alongside Selina Ballance and Elizabeth Chesterton, and were described in this way: a formidable force, immensely knowledgeable and utterly persuasive. She was also carrying out work for the National Trust, for instance, here at Elvig in North Wales, where she proposed and delivered a new visitor management scheme. In typical Beazley fashion, she not only recommended what we might call strategic changes regarding access and the use of redundant structures, but also went into detail over things like signage. Now, our knowledge, as I said, of her work at the National Trust is limited, but we know she made visits and wrote reports on 30 National Trust properties. And here are the places that we know she worked at. You'll see that apart from 4 home county sites, most of her work was in the provinces. In Wales, such as in the picture at the Dolecothi gold mines in Carmarthenshire, but also in the west and in the north of England. As I say, we don't know much about this work at the moment, but I hope to develop my understanding of that in the near future. What I do know more about is her work in Scotland. She was introduced to Scotland by this chap. He's Jamie Stormont Darling. He was the Secretary of the National Trust for Scotland for many years. And if we're talking about formidable forces, this was certainly one of them. Elizabeth came to his attention in 1967 through a piece in The Guardian called Landscape with Figures, in which she described her work and her thoughts on visitor management and visitor centres. Some money to improve its visitor centres, and they commissioned Beazley to visit them, along with some other bodies' sites as well. In all, she did 3 tours of National Trust for Scotland's sites, and she worked at some of the most important properties of the National Trust in Scotland, including Burns Cottage near Ayr, and the battlefield sites at Bannockburn and Culloden. Here's all the sites that she worked at, and you can see there are a lot of them. Some of these visits were prolonged, some of them were repeated, some of them were very brief. But we know she took in and did an assessment at each of these places. And I've got some comments here that I've drawn from her tour the second of the three that she did, burn. It abounds in possibilities, which I kind of interpret as a good way of saying it isn't achieving everything that it might. And she makes several significant recommendations for change, and indeed visited Bannockburn again later on. Depressed me greatly. This was Glencoe. Well, Glencoe is supposed to be a depressing site, but it depressed Elisabeth for the wrong reasons. She realized it was supposed to be austere and reflective, but found it trivialized by inappropriate signage, bins, and parked cars that were intruding on its natural ambience. The Mountain Rescue Centre, for instance, an excellent building, she said, but painted the wrong shade of blue. At Inverurie, the famous gardens in the northwest of Scotland, she came across a viewpoint that was intruded on by concrete seating and by poorly designed signage and other paraphernalia. She described the concrete curbs there as an insult to the National Trust for Scotland and to the Highlands, and urged their immediate removal. She found the signs needed changing and moving, as of course she would. And an unexpected detail that crops up in her report is that somehow she unearthed that the staff at Inverurie needed more waste paper bins in their offices. At Glenfinnan, a place now famous, made famous by Harry Potter, but originally made famous by Bonnie Prince Charlie, she found badly designed signage that meant that the visitor centre was bypassed by those who were following the natural route from the car park towards the monument. But in any event, the visitor centre at Glenfinnan did not, for her, explain the significance of the site. At Kylecranky, she found this rather forbidding. A "where are my hat and gloves" feeling came over me. And she suggested that the visitor centre at Kylecranky needed to be made more welcoming, suggesting, for instance, the use of cut flowers. But she said it shouldn't be in a Constance Spry style. I suspect perhaps others here do. So these give a flavour that she was able to criticize freely, and she provided an insight that was not previously noticed. She found in these visitor centres too much tourist information and too little information about the site itself, too little capturing the genius of the site. And in virtually every visit, she had comments and observations to make on signage, on the colour, the scale, and the sighting of it. But her most important project in Scotland was at Cullin, which I've marked here in yellow. And for those of you who've never seen Cullin or been there, you've missed a treat. It's the castle home of the Kennedys, built by Robert Adam in 1776, along with a redesign of the entire estate and several outlying buildings, including a farmstead for a range of different pursuits of the family. It's the flagship site of the National Trust for Scotland. It was rescued in 1945 at great financial risk to what was then a very small organisation with very limited resources, a huge gamble that they could make this site work. It's a magnificent castle in extensive grounds, perched on a cliff top overlooking the Firth of Clyde, with views as far as Northern Ireland on a good day. An A-listed building, which is the Scottish equivalent of a Class 1, now a major Scottish tourist attraction, and iconic enough to have featured on the Royal Bank of Scotland £5 note until that was replaced with its modern polymer version. In 1969, when Beazley first visited the site, it was evolving into Scotland's first country park. But the NTS acknowledged that it was hopelessly ill-positioned for this task. There was no visitor management, the toilets and catering were inadequate, information was dispensed from a small kiosk, there was little signage or encouragement for visitors to explore beyond the castle itself, and the castle was operating at capacity and urgently needed to adapt to its new circumstances. So the National Trust for Scotland contracted Beazley to help with improving the site as a visitor destination and to help with visitor management. It was an open-ended arrangement, and it lasted 17 years and involved 80 site visits and 60 written reports, most of which articulate principles and detail alike. Generally, the National Trust let Elisabeth loose to refine their flagship property. Now, her work at Cullin ended in 1984, and in the years since, thinking has changed and ideas have moved on. But we can still see signs of her legacy at Cullin. For instance, here, paths with no formal edge, and the use of contrasting surfaces to separate pedestrians from vehicles, apparently quite successfully here, since no pedestrians are using the road and cars are kept to the left-hand side of this picture. This is the southern end of Cullin Visitor Centre and near a secondary entrance. There's a road here, but cars are not permitted to obscure the buildings. And she's repurposed an old building as an aviary and a tea room, encouraging visitors to explore the whole site, safe in the knowledge that an opportunity for refreshment exists at the far end, as well as at the near the main car park. And she's used picnic furniture in this site to show that picnicking is allowed. Picnicking was a big thing for her. And here's another example. This is what she seems to have been like. She wouldn't just say, you need a cabin at the entrance where people can pay and pick up a map. She would actually design and draw it for you, show what materials it would be constructed in, identify the best location, and tell you what color it should be painted. This entrance hut ticket office that she herself designed. When I visited in 2019, I learned from the person who occupies this hut that it was now scheduled for replacement, but it was still there and still looking good when I visited. But she was originally recruited by the Natas, and it's the visitor centre at Cullin that is her most prominent legacy. At Cullin, Stormont-Darling already had a site in mind, essentially the existing small information kiosk. But on seeing it in 1969, Beazley rejected it, saying that it would not capture the genius, that phrase again, of Cullin. We might as well be in leafy Hampshire, she said. As we saw earlier, she saw the architect's role as challenging the site, and she did that here very powerfully. She'd already noticed a redundant farm building, originally designed by Robert Adam, that she saw as a delight to any architectural soul. And she persuaded Stormont-Darling to renovate the home farm as the visitor centre. It was ruinous. This picture was taken during the restoration, but it gives some clues as to its condition. But Elisabeth was able to see things as they might be, not as they already are. And you can see a quadrangular building here with appendages sticking out from each of the four sides. And she took that as the basis for a repurposing plan. Her opportunity to create a visitor centre from scratch that would embody her principles. The farm buildings were set round a square with open arches where stables and the like had been. Some areas in Beazley's concept of the new property, some areas were public facing, those marked in red on this diagram, and others marked in yellow would be operational space and storage. So she developed here an idea of a multifunctional set of buildings that would remove the need for services in the castle itself and even provide a second and alternative place for visiting and a place where visitors could be informed and encouraged to explore further. A separate architectural practice actually directed the work, but she managed to get their plans for the parking rejected and got the National Trust for Scotland to instruct them to move it further away and to landscape it. And she contributed her ideas on this visitor centre on absolutely everything, not just the rebuild itself, but also the materials to be used as flooring and lighting, designing the signage, of course, and even down to what kind of crockery and cutlery should be purchased for the restaurant. She wrote a report 15 pages long on the design and content of an audiovisual presentation for visitors. And this was the end result. The picture here was taken in 1974 on completion of the work, which cost £275,000, the equivalent of 3.8 million today. Mostly that was funded by the Scottish Office and 3 local authority partners. It won a European Heritage Award. It was featured on the nationwide programme, for those of you old enough to remember that, and it finished as runner-up in 2 other award competitions. And although it's been modified since, it's a sympathetic restoration that complemented the castle itself very well at the time, and that still does. It's still in use today, largely as Beazley intended. It serves as a focal point, but not the focal point, for visitors arriving at the castle. They have to pass the visitor centre when walking from the car park to the castle itself, and it relieves pressure at the castle, both by providing toilets and other visitor facilities that might be useful both on arrival and after the castle visit. Stormont Darling was delighted with the outcome, and he said that the trust owed her a considerable debt. It typifies Beazley in so many ways, but above all in her ability to imagine things as they might be. It wasn't perfect, and Beazley revisited it several times in her 80 reports, 80 visits, to suggest minor improvements here and there. One of these addressed an observation she overheard to the effect that toasted sandwiches were very popular in the cafe, but that people had to wait in the queue a long time while they were prepared. She suggested in her next report that the estate address this forthwith by buying a second toasting unit. This too, the woman, attention to minute detail, and no fear of stating the obvious when she saw what needed to be done. Beazley's legacy. She articulated principles that are still relevant today and defined the countryside attractions response to visitors as never before. But if you seek a memorial for her, then this building is the most visible and probably the most significant. She herself was often self-effacing, preferring the background to the limelight. But I think Cullin really ought to offer some recognition of her role in creating what was, and still is, a masterpiece of visitor centre design. But if there was to be a commemorative plaque to Elisabeth here, perhaps for the 50th anniversary of opening in 2024, any plaque would of course have to be the right location, size, typeface, and colour.
Phil, thank you very much indeed. That was absolutely enthralling.
Thank you.
While other people are unstunning themselves, may I ask you 1 or 2 questions myself? Interestingly, very occasionally, Phil, we lost you, and your immaculate illustrations, very Beazley-esque, if I may say, very well prepared, meant that until the very last one, we never missed what you were saying. But I must ask you, you said toasted sandwiches were very popular, and then we lost you for a moment, and I have no idea what her recommendations were, apart from a second toaster. Could you
well, the problem with the toasted sandwiches, she overheard this while she was in the visitor centre herself. She noticed that people were ordering toasted sandwiches and were having to stand around for a while they were cooked. And she wasn't the kind of person who would let something like that go unreported. So in her very next report, she suggested that the cafe should purchase a second sandwich toaster, which is probably something that they already had in mind. But she wasn't afraid to state what was obvious to her, and didn't kind of hold back on the basis that, oh, they must have thought about that. No, she would say it anyway, just in case they hadn't.
Did she ever give offence? Did people take it in the way it was meant?
No, there was no evidence of any adverse reaction at all. Some of her recommendations followed up on, And quite early in her contract at Cullin, she noticed that on a visit that things she'd asked for in her previous visit hadn't been done. So she reported this to Stormont's Darling, and he sent a very stroppy memo to the manager at Cullin, copied to most of the other staff on the site, saying, what Elisabeth says, I expect it to be done. And giving him what we would nowadays politely call a bollocking for not having attended to her recommendations properly. But even that chap was called Captain Mott, and she maintained a very strong friendship with him, to the point that every time she visited Cullin, she would actually stay with the Motts in their house on the estate. So even that kind of hiccup in the path didn't damage her standing or her reputation at the site at all.
Excellent. Question from Annabelle. Apart from Jellicoe and Lionel Brett, have you come across any people or landscape architects who may be her friends?
No, I haven't. She never mentions any friends in the profession at all. Apart from, she never mentions Brett. We only know that they had some sort of a relationship because she worked there and because she co-wrote a book with him. She co-wrote other books with other authors, and one might imagine that they were friendships. She was friendly with a guy called Michael Halverson, who became an Iranian expert, and they collaborated on a book about Iran. She wrote from the basis of her earlier trips, and he went on a trip. She didn't go with him. When she toured Iran, she took photographers with her, but it wasn't always the same person that went with her. She's not very open about that kind of thing at all. So I have no knowledge. And as I said at the beginning, she never mentions any of the people that taught her at the Architectural Association at all in any of the books that I've read, which is most of them.
Elizabeth's asking, what do you think she would say about the role of landscape architects today?
I think she would probably see a profession that is much more professional than the one that she seems to have had in continually describing herself as an architect and in not joining the ILA. I think she saw that as a potential dilution of her professional standing. I'm not sure that she would see things in the same light today. I think she would see landscape architecture being much more widely recognized and much more specialized. But I don't think you'd get many landscape architects today talking about sandwich toasters or about elbow rests for people with binoculars. So she might also say that the attention to detail that was very, very important to her is not as prominent as it should be.
Annabelle says, are there any oral recordings of her?
No. Well, at least none that I've found so far. As I say, I haven't researched her work for the National Trust because of lockdown. And it's possible there might be something there, but I'm not aware of anything. I don't think the nationwide broadcast is probably the only time she might have been on television, and I'm not even sure she was included in that. I think it was the camera crew visited at a time when she wasn't there, as far as I know.
Helena asks, as a woman working in a male-dominated profession, did she ever suggest any self-consciousness about this or mention any challenges?
Well, no, I don't think so. Although when you read her work, it's clearly of its time. She makes assumptions about gender roles that are frankly quite uncomfortable reading today. So the people who work in the kitchens, for instance, she would expect those to be women. And she describes the role of women in looking after children, in managing children's play, and so on, in ways that, again, we would find uncomfortable today, uncomfortable stereotyping.
Mm.
But I don't detect in any of her writing any discomfort from her point of view. She was a single woman, of course, so she had to be everything herself. I know that she bombed around the countryside in her dormobile as a single woman driver, perhaps at a time when that was less common than it would be now. But I don't detect any sensitivity on her part to that, and I don't detect any prejudice, although I'm sure that she will have encountered that from time to time.
Thank you. A comment from Zosha saying, such an interesting talk and fascinating to hear about less well-known designers. I think we can all concur with that. Alan asks, Peter Howell, the co-author of the companion guide, is still very much alive. He and his partner, Ed Distelkamp, retired National Trust, used to regularly visit Elisabeth in Suffolk, so would be a good source. Oh, thanks,
Right,
Alan.
that's very helpful. Thank you.
That's very helpful. Yes, indeed.
Yeah.
I think he'll be bombarded now.
Yeah, Suffolk was her marital home. I think she must have sold the London property when she married in 1977, and she went to live with her new husband in an old school building near Woodbridge.
And Elizabeth says elbow rests may be popular with people with mobility issues. As usual, she sounds as though she was ahead of her time.
Yeah, she wasn't thinking of people with mobility issues, though, and we don't get any kind of awareness of disabled access or provision for people with disabilities at all in her design work. She was talking about the people who use binoculars, and she'd noticed that they like to rest their elbows on something when they're holding their binoculars, especially if they're doing that for a long time. For me, it was an example of the kind of trivial detail that seems to have made a big difference for her. The obvious, or even being faintly ludicrous.
The question for myself, do we know how landscape architects viewed her? Did they view her at all? Were they aware of her?
I'm not aware of any commentary other than the reviews of her books, which were generally pretty positive. Alan Blanc, I'm not sure how you pronounce his name, he was very positive about design and detail of space between buildings, and her other books got good reviews as well. But whether these reviewers were architects or not, I couldn't say.
Okay. Are any of her books still available?
Secondhand, certainly.
Secondhand.
Yeah, I have the full set, and I bought them all off Abe Books.
Yeah, excellent. Thank you very much. Alan Blanc was an architect, we are now told.
Okay, well, he was a very positive about design and detail. Her first book, and said it was a very well worked book. And we have the added bonus of two new authors rewriting it in 1990 and republishing it with her permission, with her endorsement, as a book that was still timely, even 25 years after it was written.
Question from Katharina, apologies if I got that wrong. Do you know if she ever visited Scandinavia? Many British landscape architects came to Sweden and Denmark.
I don't. She doesn't mention, and she doesn't mention any visits to Scandinavia that I can recall, and I don't recall any examples that she draws on in Scandinavia either. And she mentions that plenty of times. And also she visited exhibitions in Brussels, for instance, and so on. So she does draw on her foreign visits, and the fact that she never mentions Scandinavia suggests that she didn't go, or possibly that if she did, she didn't see anything that particularly struck her as requiring her attention. But I think probably she didn't go.
Another Stefan says, thanks for a fascinating presentation. I previously knew her only from the Shell Guide and Maddox and the Wonder of Wales. I assume she was living and potentially working in Wales during the great resurgence of the Welsh language. Do you know if the Welsh burnt her cottage or?
No, they didn't. It's still there. I visited it last year in that brief spell that we had when we weren't in lockdown. I took a trip to St. David's, and her cottage is still there. She used it as a kind of bolt hole, but she evidently worked there as well, because some of the reports that she did for the National Trust for Scotland have that address on them for response. So she was obviously staying there for more than a week or two. And it's a delightful little cottage tucked away around the back of, in the back streets of St. David's. She doesn't mention the Welsh language at all, but she did write for Welsh journals, including journals that would have included pieces in the Welsh language. She didn't herself write in Welsh.
Not many do. Sorry, I come from a mixed marriage, half Welsh, half English, so I speak with feeling. Helena says, did she write about the role of a knowledge of landscape or architectural history in her work? She seemed to be quoting Alexander Pope.
Well, I don't recall her quoting Pope, but history was a big part of the second half of her career, because a lot of it was spent in countryside sites that were historic sites. So most of those sites in Scotland that I put up on the map were National Trust for Scotland properties, and therefore by definition they were historic sites. So she was concerned to see that these sites interpreted their history as part of the offer that they made to visitors. But she wanted them to be more than just historic sites. She wanted them also to offer a diversity of experience according to what the visitor was looking for. So at Cullin, I mean, you wouldn't go to Cullin without going into the castle. It's a very, very striking property. But if you've been around the castle, you might still go back to Cullin because it's a beautiful place to be. There are places you can have a picnic. There are places your children can run around. There are places they can kick a ball. The visitor centre does a very nice line in tea and cakes, and so on. There would be for her lots of reasons to go to a site, not just the history that might draw you there in the first place.
You can certainly speak well of both the castle and the visitor centre from personal experience.
You've been, have you?
Yes, I have. Also, I must just amend my previous comment. Not many English people write in Welsh is what I meant before I get divorced. Karen remarks, as Annabelle said at the beginning, most of us had design and details between buildings on our shelves. That's how I was aware of her work, but fantastic to learn of her other publications. Do you plan to publish this research in due course?
Yeah, there's Jan and I have co-authored a paper which is coming out in the Journal of Garden History in, I believe, in July. And that will cover quite a lot of this ground. We also co-authored a paper on Cullin, which appeared in Landscape Research last year. Again, there's a little overlap between these two papers, but not much, otherwise Garden History wouldn't have accepted the second one. But the second paper is more about Beazley, the first paper is more about Cullin, but obviously recognises Beazley's role in Cullin, in creating the Cullin that we see now.
Sorry, the questions just jumped down my screen. Did she ever write about planting design or demonstrate much knowledge of plant materials?
Yes, she does write about that. She talked, for instance, about the kind of planting that should be used to landscape a car park, to make a car park look at least making an attempt to be reasonably attractive. But I noticed in one of her reports on Cullin, Cullin also had an arboriculturalist who visited from time to time, and he had some problems with some trees alongside one of the roads, and recommended that they be removed. And the next time Elisabeth visited, she was absolutely horrified to see that these trees had been removed and replaced with what she considered to be a completely unsuitable species. Now, I'm afraid that I can't tell you what was removed and what was replaced, but I remember this quite fiery exchange between her and her employer about allowing this to happen. And it was quite a rare expression of frustration on her part that this had been done, and perhaps particularly done without consulting with her on the impact that it would have on the character of the area in question.
Annabelle says, brilliant to hear of publication, well done, and we look forward to this. And Elisabeth follows that up with, it might be nice to have an article in the LI magazine to raise awareness more generally. So that might be something you'd want to explore with the editor.
I mean, that might be, as I've said, I plan to try and fill the gaps in my knowledge of Elisabeth, and that might be something that a further paper, perhaps in the LI magazine, might be hung on. Because it would be additional material to that which has already been published elsewhere.
Commissioning editor Paul Lincoln, just to give you that information.
Yeah.
Has anybody else any questions? Thank you very much for all those which have extended the discussion delightfully. If not, Annabelle, are you there?
Yes, I am indeed.
I'll pass back to you, please.
Yes. Phil, I think that was fantastic. I feel really encouraged by not fearing of stating the obvious. I think that's possibly one of the most important messages to take away, because I think not everybody sees the same or sees things the same way, and I think her clarity of vision is just is fabulous.
Well, I think you're right, Annabelle. We assume that because it's obvious to us, it must be obvious to everyone else, and that clearly isn't the case. Sometimes she got into one or two problem areas there. I mean, she recommended a particular shade of paint for the doors at Cullin, for instance, and there was a bit of fuss internally about, you know, why the hell does the color of the paint matter on these garage doors and so on. But they did it, and as far as I can tell, they're still the same color.
Well, thank you very much indeed. Thank you so much for starting our series in such a spectacular way.
Oh, thank you very much. You're very kind. But I've enjoyed putting this presentation together, and I feel from having done it that I know her a little better than I did when I started.
Yeah. Oh, brilliant. Well, I hope there'll be lots of feedback and I don't know, other comments about, you know, other bits of information that people know about that you haven't, you know, covered or yet found or whatever.
Yeah, well, that would be very interesting. I mean, as you can see, we've got enough material here to fill quite a lengthy presentation, but there's still quite a bit more that we don't know at this point.
Yeah. Oh, brilliant. Thank you so much.
My pleasure. Thank you. Thank you for inviting me.
Okay.
Can I ask everyone to unmute and give Phil a round of applause, please?
Thank you.